So welcome to this week's episode of Leadership Soundbites with RokoM, Michelle, and our very special guest, Paul Stamper. And I'm going to read Paul's title. I wrote it down somewhere. Here it is. Deputy Executive Officer for the County of Ventura. And Paul and I actually connected on LinkedIn, had a chat about stuff, and we landed on this week's topic, which is the power of disruption. So I'm going to kick us off with a quote that fits, I think, to what we're going to be talking about. Is disruptions are difficult to create and even harder to manage, but they are the source of great change. So when I think about that, I think back to what I heard decades ago, probably, is that healthcare, for example, people would say was ripe for disruption. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that anyone in healthcare went pick me for what happened during COVID, for example. But I look back to that and think, if I think about the power of disruption, there were so many opportunities, and Roko and I talked about this, that whatever our assumptions were about why things took so long, or all the structures that we had in place, that we have to do this and then this and then this, we just blew it up. We were able to activate resources quickly to be able to do stuff that we never could do before. And I saw the same thing when the fires hit in California. Mm-hmm. Resources were activated. And so I think about that. And the question I have for me is, how can we activate those resources without having this negative power disruption, right, that causes so much to so many people? So that's what's on my mind. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Sure, I'm happy to start. When I think about disruption, what comes to mind for me is forced change. Mm-hmm. Right? It's thrust upon us, and it often comes with, danger, fear, uncertainty. So it's uncomfortable, and it affects everyone in different ways. Mm-hmm. And individuals and communities respond in different ways. There are definitely some ways to prepare and anticipate to a certain extent. But in any measure along those lines, every county has what we call a Office of Emergency Services, and they are spending their time anticipating different things that happen. This is not the first pandemic that's happened, right? And so there are and were many things in place, but it never is exactly the same, even from one fire to the next, et cetera. Being as prepared as you can, but adapting to the specific circumstances is what's really required. Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about the fact that the COVID pandemic in particular didn't only affect healthcare and the economy, but it affected individuals and families in a profound way. One of the podcasts that Michelle, you and Roko did earlier, which I really enjoyed, was on the power of family. And I know you brought your daughter Samantha in, and you guys were talking about different experiences, and it made me think about my experience of COVID with my family. I have 4 kids. 3 of those are teenage girls, so I'm no stranger to crisis and uncertainty. I like to say that I have 20 years of experience making lots of mistakes, and then hopefully learning from them. I frequently joke that one of my kids is constantly questioning things, and I know they're going to grow up to be a lawyer, but that's a good thing, because one of my other kids is going to need a lawyer one day. But
the power of family.
Yeah, it is, and it's the ups and downs. I love my family, and then for 2 years of COVID, all of a sudden, my office was in my dining room table at home. And I had a wife and 4 kids doing remote schooling, and we were all home together all the time. And no dance, no Boy Scouts, no other activities. We got to know each other in ways that I didn't anticipate. But, you know, we figured out how to make it work. But at the root of it is change and figuring out how you can make things work with the hand you've been dealt or the circumstances you find yourself in.
Yeah. Roko, what are your thoughts?
My
brain's going.
I know. Could you tell I was on the edge of my seat waiting? So for me too, as we talk a lot about process improvement and the lean management system, and it's all about continuous improvement. And, the Department of Emergency Services, they are preparing for disasters, and they are looking for ways to be more prepared for those disasters. And whether it's in your family, continuously improving things, or in your business life, continuously improving things. The power of disruption to me really is, it does force you, and you said it, Paul, it forces you to think differently, because it puts you into the situation, whether you want to be put into it or not. And the incremental change that we've talked about in the past segments has been more of intentional. We're intentionally trying to improve, where disruption is your thrust in it, whether you want it or not. And it, whether you sink or swim determines how you respond to that disruption. And I think that's where the innovation comes from. And that to me is where the power is that you're choosing not to sink, you're choosing to swim, and you're figuring out, how am I going to swim and survive through this disruption.
The other thing too, when I think about, like, Paul, you were talking about the Office of Emergency Services, my brain immediately went to, that's typically for shorter term things, right? We're going to control, contain, manage this thing that happened, kind of like fires. Let's get containment around the thing and we can move forward. COVID was all bets are off, if we talk about that. So when I think about that example that you gave, that your kids had all the activities, lives were going on, people were living outside the home, you were fighting for time together as a family unit. And then all of a sudden you were fighting for alone time because the family unit was together all the time. And it's an interesting, in a nanosecond overnight, how that happens. And then we have the reality of this isn't going away anytime soon. Yeah. Right. And I think that part of it too, when you talk about disruption, to your point, Roko, we didn't plan it.
Right.
But we need to plan it now, right after it hits. What is the plan once it hit? And there's a grieving, and I know I went through it with the realization of the old way of life that we thought we were going to go back to wasn't there anymore, right? And so when I think about leaders leading through disruption, you have to recognize your teams are going to go through that stuff too.
Yeah. So what were some of the things that you did to work with the family or in the workspace? What did you do to work through some of those changes?
Well, on the family side, it was daily, how's everyone doing today? And checking in and trying to get creative and figure out how, like, even though change is thrust upon you, it often, like the quote reference, it creates other opportunities that you didn't have before.
Yeah.
And so, we tried to look for those. We did several of those caravan birthday parties where people would drive through the neighborhood with balloons and horns and so forth. We got one of the shaved ice trucks to come for the neighborhood kids, and so they even invented a game of tag where they were using noodles from the pool so they could keep their distance, but that's how they would chase and tag each other, so we got creative. And on the work side, it's definitely a little more structured. Emergency response generally falls into response and recovery.
Mhm.
Right? The response is what's the emergent need,
Mhm.
and like you said, and we've, and the County of Ventura, as it happens, had experienced multiple disasters leading up to COVID.
Mhm.
And so, of course, that was unfortunate, but it also put us in a better position to be able to quickly respond to COVID.
Mhm.
And so, for instance, the Thomas Fire in 2017, at the time, that was the largest fire in the state of California's history. It took more than a month to contain it, 280,000 acres burned, and we lost over 1,000 homes.
Wow.
And so there was, that was what we considered at the time, wow, this is a long response period,
Mhm.
before we got to recovery. Little did we know, that we were about to experience the longest response time for any disaster in our lifetime. And so the good part was we had things in place. We had identified partners. As it happens, our county had recently, in the previous few years, gone through and created a county-wide economic vitality strategic plan. And so in that process, we had very good connections with the business community who, as it turns out, atypical to fires, they were profoundly impacted by this particular event. And so that gave us a head start by, we have a cadre of local service providers to the business community that were already meeting regularly, already working on goals. And one of the good things that came out of this is people needed information. And for the first time, we had business owners, thousands and thousands of business owners registering with us to get updates, to acknowledge that they've satisfied the different COVID requirements to reopen. And now we have a direct line of communication that we've never had before.
Yeah.
And we can send more targeted messages rather than just, here's a Facebook post or a Twitter tweet, to everyone. No, we can say, okay, what are the industry types that this grant coming up relates to? And let's target them directly and specifically explain how to go about pursuing it, things like that.
What I love is because my brain kept going, power of disruption. What's the upside, right?
Yeah.
And to take a look and say, okay, we're connecting, we're collecting information on how to contact you because we need this, right? We want to keep you informed on this. But how else can we, utilize these avenues or methods of communication that differently for the future? And I think that's it too. It's like I was talking to RokoM and we debrief with other leaders, and we'll use COVID because COVID's in my lifetime probably the most significant pandemic thing that's happened. But it's like, how do you look back and say, we went through this thing, we came out the other side better, stronger, wiser. And so how does it inform how we do things differently on a go forward, right? What lessons have we learned? And for me, that's the upside of it, right? Is that you come out of this thing and you basically blow up everything that, or a lot of things that you thought couldn't be done a different way than what you were currently doing them. And overnight, like if someone told you, walked up and said, Paul, we're going to have you, your wife, and your 4 children all work in the same house. You're going to work remotely. You're going to run your job. They're going to go to school remotely and everything like that. And you're going to go, no, can't happen. Okay.
That's right.
But no one gave you the heads up that this is going to happen. And we were, to your point, you were thrust into what this thing is. So I have to wonder, and Roko, your thoughts too, because you've gone through your own stuff. What do you now do differently that
Mhm.
that as a result of what you went through, that you won't go back to the old way because of what you learned and what you've gone through? Is there something that comes to mind?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, is that for me or for RokoM? I'm
It can
happy
be
to
either
For
one.
you, for you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So, there are so many things that's so great. One of my favorite expressions is that nobody can predict the future with certainty, but everyone can plan for the future, or at least the future possibilities. And so you will hear experts that have differing opinions on which COVID changes are going to stick and which things are going to go back to the way they were before. And a lot of us may have personal opinions on which ones we agree with or not. But whatever it is, we know there's going to be a mix of both. So we have an opportunity to plan for both. And so, from a county perspective, we are definitely thinking first and foremost about what are the needs that we see, the new emerging needs, and particularly in the areas of the people that were most impacted by this. And we're aiming for an equitable and inclusive recovery because not everyone was impacted the same, right? And so we really need to give people a hand up who were impacted more severely. Now, here's some examples of that we've already figured out for sure. We know that more people now are using the internet and computers. Simultaneously, we know that there are many communities that have limited access to broadband, right? It's not financially feasible for the private companies to come in and set up the infrastructure when they project only a certain number of users will come and use it. And so we've already had initiatives underway for years with our broadband consortium, but now we've actually got some additional funding that we can pick and choose where we want to spend it. And that's an example of one place we're going to spend it. Now, another example that's abundantly clear is that mental health needs to be a priority. You can read stat after stat about how people have been impacted on a mental and emotional level from this. And unfortunately, you can see the stats with increased anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide, alcoholism, right? These are going to be long-term areas where we need to dedicate resources to support those. And so there's many other examples, but there's an opportunity here to say, where do we think, what direction are things going to go? And to your point earlier, I also want to add that there are some very positive opportunities that have come from this that we want to double down on too. So for an example, we have lots of people that are going to be working remotely and hybrid. And so that means less gas and emissions, right? There's an opportunity to reduce that and improve environmental impact, right? That means more time. I noticed it means less dry cleaning for me, right? There's lots of saving opportunities. And so what are the different ways that we can take advantage of those? And, from that lean background perspective, the whole layout of where do we see the waste have just changed significantly. And things that used to be required are no longer going to be required. So what are we going to do with that? And so there's definitely lots of, emphasis on trying to look at those possible areas. Now, I'll be the first one to raise my hand and say, I'm not good at predicting which ones are going to be which. Okay, I know this because as a kid, I signed up for the Columbia Records deal, right? I thought, that's where get 2,000 CDs for a nickel, and then you have to buy one a month for the rest until you retire. But I thought that was a lifetime investment, right? I didn't think about the media changing. So there's going to be some areas where we're going to be wrong and predict incorrectly. But the principles of looking for what might change and trying to prepare yourself, that's good advice for every person, family, and organization.
Yeah, no, I agree. Roko, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so 2 takeaways that I've had based on what you've just shared is it changed the way you plan and think about how you plan for responding and recovering from different emergencies. And you've taken this positive outlook to it to say, hey, let's try and predict, let's think out of the box around what might change given our new environment, and how now can we use resources differently to address problems that might have been around for a while now, but are now fundable because of the changes that have occurred with this disruption. And so I love that methods piece. And then socially, I loved what you were sharing with your family example where you checked in. So as a leader myself, one of the things that I did during the pandemic is checked in regularly with my staff to say, how's it going? Because we have to take care of our personal needs in order to be able to take care of our business needs. If we're not healthy and secure and stable, we're not going to be able to show up in a way that is going to be productive when we go to work. So I love the fact that you took that and you said it was daily, you checked in, and I just love it. If we talk about, you can't do it monthly, you can't do it quarterly, you got to do it every day, real time,
Well, and so the point is not everyone came through the disruption or comes through any disruption in the same condition you mentioned. It's like mental health. I think COVID, the mental health issue has been around. I think it fast tracked the number of people impacted by it because, literally worlds were turned upside down. The upside of it, to your point, is there's highlighting and surfacing and highlighting a problem or a situation that needs help and attention and has always needed it. And it's been for decades that we were in healthcare that they were talking about mental health issues that wasn't getting the attention. And it was their stigma around it. So I think a lot of stuff has surfaced to where it's more acceptable to talk about, to admit, to get help. So I think there are upsides to things like this surfacing to where it's a conversation at the table now, where before it may have been, I'm going to hide it and I'm going to put on a happy face and no one will know. Right. So I agree. There's a lot of really, it's an interesting topic and it has so many different legs to it because it depends on what you're talking about disruption. Is it the iPhone that came out to where we've got a smart device that's a mini computer in our hands, from the flip phone, from the rotary dial on the wall? Or is it a pandemic that just landed at our feet that we had to step in and overnight everything changed? But there is, as we successfully navigate through it, an upside on the other side, and it would be a waste not to recognize, the good that came out of it, that you can hold on to and learn from on a go forward. I like the 2 examples that you just used, because the iPhone, for example, it has upsides and downsides as well. Ask any parent of a teenager, right? There are challenges associated with it, as well as the incredible power and benefits from it. And so often, good change and what we might consider bad change does have elements of both. And so, how you respond to that, like I think you said earlier, Roko, will change your outcome. It will change how it ultimately affects you and those around you. And I can tell you that I have not met a single person yet
that hasn't been directly impacted by family or friends through COVID. You know,
Yeah.
whether it's the actual healthcare condition or loss of a job, etc. These are very personal experiences that you can't take a clinical point of view because it's too meaningful to every single person.
Yeah.
And so I just think your comment about mental health and how it's become more acceptable and people feel more able to say, I need some help.
Yeah.
And that some of that stigma has been removed. And boy, I hope that trend continues. I hope that's the direction we keep going in that area.
Yeah.
I'm so curious too, Paul, you know, as a, for me at least, going through COVID and having that disruption changed the way, I mean, I learned things about myself in how I dealt with it, and whether it was at work or personally. But I'm curious, you know, what impact did it have on you when you reflect back on it?
Yeah. You know, the first thing that comes to mind, I'll relate back to my comment earlier in the podcast when I said I've had 20 years worth of mistakes to learn from. And my first thought is, I think there's a lot of people in the world who have had times through this period where they've struggled or haven't handled things well and wish they could have handled things differently. And that it is a learning experience. And you know, having friends, coworkers, family, and people that will show you grace and stick by you through those times, that's been something I've truly appreciated. And at the same time, I don't think I fully recognized the support network that I actually have. And it's become an area for me of gratitude.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
we could probably continue talking about this all day, which is probably not going to be good for anybody. So I'll ask the final thing, and because I've so appreciated the time, and my brain is going in a few different directions, but I'm going to ask you, what 1 to 2 things, Paul, would you like people to walk away with on the topic of the power of disruption in our time today? Excellent.
You know, just last week, I happened to be watching a documentary on Netflix or one of the streaming channels, and it's the one where Captain Kirk gets to go to space for real.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos has a quote when he's talking to him during that, and he says, this is new stuff, you know, we're figuring out as we go. And I could really relate to that. But he said, our approach is we're going to be stubborn on the vision, the mission that we have, but we're going to be flexible on the detail. And so I found that was our approach throughout Lean. And I know we didn't get a lot of time to talk about kind of the county and the way that it implemented that, taking Lean and that mindset of the important thing is that we're aiming for certain outcomes. And that doesn't change. But let's be flexible on using what I call rapid PDCA constantly. You know, try it, what's working, what's not working, adapt, and keep moving. We call that fail faster. Yes. Yeah. And we have to have you back then.
I was just gonna say, that means we just have to have you back, Paul, so that we have a chance to talk about that, because you made my heart sing.
Yeah. Thank you. Roko, what's on your mind?
You know, so from a leadership perspective, I think the 2 takeaways was really check in from a social aspect, because change is hard, as we've said before, and disruption is probably even harder because it's being thrust upon you. So check in and make sure people are okay, you know, how they're adjusting to the change. But really and then the other thing is just utilizing the resources that you have, thinking differently about the resources you have. I think that was pretty powerful.
Yeah. There's a lot that comes out of it.
How could you
But
choose? There's so much.
Here's where my brain went, Paul, when you were talking about the support network that you had that you didn't realize you had. And I think that's true with change that we go through, especially if we're people that don't normally tap other people for help. And that when things happen, right, COVID or whatever else it may be, it's the network's been there, even if you haven't tapped them, right? But to be open to tapping them and asking for help. And the other thing that resonated to me is giving people grace. We had Christopher Mack on, and we were talking about authenticity, the power of authenticity. And it was around, he said, my kids will come in and, you know, I have to fix some, you know, food or whatever. And I'm on a meeting call, a Zoom call. People are accepting of that. My dog is snoring in the background right now. Okay. And so
We'll give you grace.
Yeah. So, but we've come to accept that. And I think that's that we've created judgment-free zones in places that had judgment before. And so for me, it's like, think about that, is to step into the space of the room without judgment, give people grace, because this is an ever evolving, changing world that we're in. And I think we just fast tracked it with everything that went on. So anyway, I've appreciated this time. If you have an interest, we would love to have you back to talk about process improvement, especially within government operations, which is so stinking cool. But for Roko and I and Paul, this has been Leadership Soundbites. Please like, share, subscribe, and until next time, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.